Hey guys, before we get into the show today, Melvin and I would like to remind you how you can support the show.
First thing you can do is subscribe to the podcast and then leave us a 5-star rating. And if you are so kind, you could also leave us a written review. This would really help us get our name out there and help people find us.
That's right. Additionally, you can head over to lifeofxpodcast.com, click through to our support page where you will find a link to our Patreon page where you can become a patron on Patreon on a per episode basis.
You can also find a link to Audible on our support page, and if you go through our link, you will get one free book. Although the book that we use for this week's podcast will not be on there. That's the Generalissimo by Jay Taylor, but there are a few other books on Chiang Kai-shek that you could find.
Lastly, we are part of the Amazon affiliate program, which pretty much just means that if you go through our link, which you will also find on our support page, Amazon will give us a small percentage of the purchase price of whatever you buy. So if you're looking to buy anything, large, small, regardless, just go on over, click through our support page, and you can also help support the Life of X.
All we want for Christmas is for you to buy all of your gifts on Amazon through our portal.
That's right. All right. Without further ado, let's get into the show. Hello and welcome to the podcast. My name is Arif Jadala.
And I'm Melvin Barnes.
And that makes this the Life of X. Melvin, how are you?
I'm good, feeling great.
Amen. We are here to record Chiang Kai-shek, Part 4.
He's taking up a whole month.
He is, and probably more than that. But before we dive in, we would like to thank everyone who has taken the time to leave us ratings and reviews in iTunes. We really appreciate that. And we were kind of talking about this, and we've decided that we would like to read some of your ratings on each episode. So whenever we get a new rating, we will acknowledge you by username, and we will read your rating. So we will start from the beginning. I'm going to take the first one. Probably do like 2 or 3 of these each episode, not to take the whole time, you know?
Let's do it.
All right, so the first one, Pretty Cool, by Citizen Ooh. And they say, I'm not really into reading biographies, but listening is another story. I get to learn about someone interesting and get some fun commentary from Arif and Melvin. Excited for more episodes.
I like that started off with, I'm not really into biographies, but we still made the cut.
That's right.
Our next is from Jim and Missy. They say, great job. They described our podcast as informative, factual, witty, and entertaining. And they said they will definitely tune in for future episodes.
May or may not be my in-laws. Our third review was from JP Build. He says, must listen. A quick and easy way to learn about history. Hosts are engaging and informed. I love the banter and the humanizing element of their storytelling. Well, a great and easy listen.
We are human, and I do like the fact that we are apparently informed. So
that's right. Again, thank you all for leaving those. We will continue to read 1 or 2 of those, maybe 3 like we did today, as they come in. So please continue to leave them. Much appreciated. But let's dive back in to Chiang Kai-shek. We left off with Chiang Kai-shek blowing up the Yellow River dikes.
Yeah, we're deep into the war. You know, the war is hot. And Chiang just blew up the Yellow River dikes and killed
800,000 of his own people.
Yeah, it's really hard to wrap your head around how kind of crazy that actually was. I mean, I think it'd be like if you blew up some non-existent dikes and you flooded part of Ohio, Michigan, and Illinois.
Yeah.
And killed 1 million people.
I feel like I say this every time we talk about some crazy tragedy that occurs in one of these episodes, but I feel like 800,000 people is one of those numbers that it like goes right over your head because you can't even conceptualize it.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, at this point, that's sometimes one of the tough things about reading history is at a certain point, it almost feels like, oh, these are just numbers. But you have to think like, man, that's a person.
Yeah, that's like someone's life. Like
yeah.
You think about your own life and every memory and experience that has made up your life.
There are states in the United States that don't have 800,000 people in it.
Well, I mean, honestly, you probably go through your entire life and not lay eyes on 800,000 people. So we ended on sort of a somber note. We had also covered the rape of Nanjing. Pretty dark.
Yeah.
It's not going to get a whole lot brighter for a little while.
Yeah, we are in the darkness, but they say it is darkest before dawn.
They do say that. And I say, buckle up, dear listener, because the dawn is not for a while off.
Yeah, we've got a lot of darkness.
We got a lot of nighttime left.
Yeah.
All right. Let's jump back in.
Really, we just talked about the dikes being blown up, the rape of Nanjing. One thing that's important to remember is that during this time, things are changing diplomatically around the world. The Russians are worried about German appeasement. They have been sort of angling to avoid a conflict with Nazi Germany, but they're seeing a very aggressive Nazi Germany. Germany had just annexed parts of Czechoslovakia, and what we saw was the British and the French kind of coming in and not saying, hey, Germany, you're not going to do this anymore, but sort of saying, okay, we see you doing this.
We would like you not to.
We're not really down to fight right now, so we'll say, sure, you can get away with that. Obviously, this kind of emboldens Germany and doesn't bode well for really the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. And in all of this, kind of one of the wildest things is we have to remember that, so when we talk about World War II, there's the Japanese and German alliance. But during this whole conflict, up until this point, Germany has been supplying arms and training to Chiang Kai-shek's government. So Germany is actively supporting someone that Japan is fighting, right? At this point, Japan and Germany haven't formally sort of created that axis with, including Italy, obviously. So this is the point, actually, after the rape of Nanjing, where Japan finally gets Hitler to stop supporting Chiang's government with military aid.
So Japan was aware that Chiang was receiving aid from Germany?
Yeah, no, they were absolutely aware. And it's kind of wild to think about it, just that, sometimes if you look at pictures from this period, you see Chinese soldiers and they're wearing that iconic German helmet, right? That we associate with Germans during World War II. So, yeah, it's very clear. Everyone knows that the Germans are working with the Chinese. But at this point, that gets severed. The Japanese successfully get Germany to walk away. And there was one actual supposed German, who had agreed to stay on because he, didn't agree with the Germans walking away. But it turns out that this guy was actually a KGB agent. But he was...
Of course he was.
His cover story was that he was a brown shirt that, something had happened and he'd become a concentration camp escapee and ended up in China somehow. A real wild story, but he turned out to be a KGB agent. So in the mid part of 1938, the Chinese city of Wuhan falls.
Now, where is Wuhan?
Wuhan
Specifically on the chicken.
Wuhan. So if you imagine the chicken, and Shanghai is sort of where the chicken's belly button would be. Do chickens even have belly buttons?
No, they don't. Okay, and you keep saying that.
Well, whatever. Shanghai's where the belly button would be. A little further west is where Nanjing would be.
Okay.
And then you go further west from there, and you end up at Wuhan. So what you can imagine is that the Japanese are pushing deeper into China, central China from Shanghai. So they're just kind of skipping to the major cities. They're going Shanghai, Nanjing, Wuhan. In late October, early November of 1938, Wuhan would fall to the Japanese. But one thing that's kind of crazy that happens is the soldiers, the forces in Wuhan, realize that the Japanese cavalry is approaching the city and that they're going to enter the city. And what they end up doing is they end up just burning a lot of the city to the ground.
The Chinese soldiers did.
Yeah, and officials, because they wanted to, I guess, deny the Japanese a complete city. Right? I mean, it's when you get there, obviously, if there's no buildings for you to stay in, then you have to camp outside, things like that. And there was one story about a military hospital being burned down, and there were sick and wounded that were still inside.
Jeez.
And I think we get this account from maybe a Western missionary that had been living in Wuhan. So some really
dark stuff.
And I mean, for China at this point in time in the battle, this is bad. Things aren't looking good. But after this, that kind of ends the first major phase of the fighting. And at this point, China's most important eastern cities, so Shanghai, Nanjing, Suzhou, Wuhan, they had all fallen to the Japanese. And Japan had hoped that China would give up after all of this. But they're in a pretty bad situation. I mean, Chiang learned that his forces, in order to actually defeat the Japanese, he calculated that they needed 6-1 odds. So 6 divisions to every 1 Japanese division. And Chiang's approach was largely defensive, I mean, obviously with odds that bad, you're not going around picking too many fights. And they, in the midst of all of this, relocated the capital, obviously, from Nanjing to further inland in China to a city called Chongqing, which is in Sichuan province, which is even further west than Wuhan. And what they're banking on is China is an absolutely massive country. It is roughly the size of the United States, and that's including Alaska. So the understanding is it's tough to push troops really deep into China. It'd be like if the Japanese landed in California and had to fight their way all the way to Ohio. It's tough. And the Japanese really did not have the capacity to do that. So
I think that would be difficult logistically now. I'm thinking back to World War II.
It would be unbelievably difficult logistically. I mean, there are very few countries that can supply troops that far away from home. And unfortunately for Japan, and fortunately for China, Japan was not one of those countries that could, muster that kind of force.
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the reasons that people have said that invasions of Russia have always failed.
Realistically, invasions of Russia, it doesn't look good if you're going to invade Russia. You really can't invade China, and you really can't invade the United States. These countries are just, they're too big, geographically too diverse, and too difficult to maneuver in. So the nationalists, they relocate their capital to Chongqing, and a lot of men and material flow that way with them. So they're moving all this stuff along the rivers, and all these people are fleeing the Japanese, right? There's a lot of people that stay behind, but there's also a lot of people that move west with the nationalist government. The nationalists, by this point in time, had lost 90% of their industry, and I think up to 80% of their arms industry. So they moved as much as they could, but they couldn't obviously move everything.
And then trying to produce was, good luck.
Right. So it was tough.
Yeah, looking pretty bleak.
Yeah, and, so China has to turn to conscripting soldiers. And this is one of the, again, another kind of dark spot on the nationalist record is that they have to go around rounding up guys and saying, like, you're in the army now, whether you like it or not. And there was stories about some, soldiers going into villages and literally leading people out in chains. And under these situations, it's no wonder that, some of these guys didn't perform that well.
Right. Like, what kind of morale? If you're the guy being led out in chains,
yeah,
like obviously you don't want to go and fight. But even if you're a soldier who's committed to the cause, like
you still don't like.
Right, you're like, oh, this is how we're getting new recruits.
Right. So I mean, the conscription rate in China was only 0.4%, which it's a massive country. So 0.4% actually turns out to be a lot of people. In Russia, it was as high as 3%. So Soviets as high as 3%, and Japan was humming along at 1.3%. So, conscription was a thing back then, and let's not forget the U.S. also had a draft system. This is what you had to do to stay in a war, like the Second World War.
Yeah, it's like so crazy to think about how different a total war like the World Wars must have been to live through, even as just like a civilian.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was one of those situations where obviously no one went untouched from the war.
Because, in the modern wars that, I've been alive for, I mean, I guess I was alive for Desert Storm, but,
Your life doesn't change that much.
Really? No, I mean, like in terms of Afghanistan, Iraq, military operations now.
If you didn't have a friend or family member that was fighting, or you yourself was fighting, I mean, you could go along and not even know.
Seriously, if you didn't turn on the news or whatever, like you don't know who's, you don't know what soldiers are dying every day or, I mean, it's like, but then the entire society was behind.
Right. I mean, you have to remember there's rationing.
Right.
You can't just go buy chocolate bars.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You can't just go buy a car because certain materials are being rationed for the armed
Or
forces.
a tank of gas for that matter.
Yeah. And you're supposed to take things from home. Maybe soldiers need silk to make parachutes, so you've got to turn in dresses, things like that. So I mean, that was one of those things where the entire society had to sacrifice. And honestly, one of the scary things about war nowadays is that when countries can fight wars and not feel it, makes them probably too quick to fight wars.
Yeah, it's one of those dichotomies, because on one hand, it's a good thing that your citizens aren't necessarily being affected or necessarily in immediate danger, but also there's a level of detachment then that becomes,
dangerous.
Like citizens aren't even aware of what's actually going on.
And they think, oh yeah, we can go to war.
Yeah, war is fine. Like, we've been at war since 2003 and I ain't felt anything.
Exactly. And we got to stress, man, for China, this was not that war. It was in your face. I mean, you're chilling at home one day and the next day you got Japanese soldiers kicking your door in.
Or KMT forces kicking your door in and saying, hey, your son is now our soldier.
So, one of the interesting things is that going back to Chiang and the way that he constituted his forces, a lot of these guys were, again, warlords that had just been roped into the KMT. But we've got to remember that most of Chiang's best forces have been obliterated by the Japanese. So the power balance within the KMT is now changing. A lot of those warlords, especially the ones that had remained in the south, they've maintained a portion of their strength. So the power balance within the KMT is it's shifting a little bit. He's losing a little bit of that authority.
They see that King's Landing is weak.
Oh, God. Now, on top of all of this, while Chiang is sort of being pushed back onto his heels, the CCP is doing very well. The war itself created some breathing space for the CCP. As bad as it was for the country, the CCP membership is exploding. Politically, the CCP was just better than the KMT.
That's what it seems like. Ways. I mean, obviously, you've been studying this for a long time, but even in just reading Taylor, it felt like every time there was an opportunity for Mao to exploit a bad situation that the KMT was going through, he never missed the opportunity. And he was always like a step or half a step ahead, it seemed like.
Yeah, and I think that the membership of the CCP was more focused.
Yeah.
So, the issue again with the KMT is you have a bunch of people brought into the party, but that maybe they're not necessarily all that dedicated. Whereas in the case of the communist, it seems like most of the guys that they had were really dedicated.
Yeah, this was like a strong ideological fervor.
Right. And, when you join the CCP, there wasn't really these competing. There was, but it was a different sort of competing loyalties. So one thing was, like, if your forces joined the CCP, you weren't like a warlord dude anymore. Like, you're a CCP force. You're centralized under their power structure, and you're not playing by your own fiddle. Whereas in the KMT, it seemed like there was a lot of that sort of space for autonomy that you just didn't have in the CCP. So when they moved, they were able to move sort of together and as one. And the KMT seemed to struggle to do that in many places. And their membership in 1937 was about 40,000 people. But by 1940, the membership of the CCP had exploded to 800,000.
Now I have a question about this, because as we discussed earlier, a lot of the CCP membership came from not in the cities, from like the outskirts, from the rural areas. As people are being displaced by the Japanese who are taking these major cities, I imagine that they are being pushed into the more rural areas, and the CCP are kind of there to just scoop them up. Is that sort of what's happening?
I think in some cases, that's probably what's happening. The CCP has a base in northern China. They're in a location called Yan'an. And during this time, Yan'an becomes almost this place for pilgrimage. You have a lot of people who maybe they're disillusioned with the KMT. And instead of maybe heading towards Chongqing, they'll head to Yan'an. So, I mean, the CCP was an amalgamation of, obviously you had intellectuals, but you also had the rural, what we'd call the hoi polloi, just the people. You had some vagrants, all kinds of people had found their way into the CCP. But, the CCP, I mean, it wasn't all roses and sunshine,
Sure.
The thing with the CCP was if you rocked the boat too much or created some issues, it was very easy for them to just expel you or purge you however they saw fit. Maybe for some people that meant death, and maybe for some people that meant, they're just forced out of Yan'an. So they were able to sort of create this homogenous group, or more homogenous, where the KMT really struggled with that. Because you have to remember, the CCP is able to build up and establish these base areas. The KMT had to take control of all of China, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The cities themselves, for all of their issues, everything, that was all under the KMT's umbrella, man.
Was the CCP actually fighting the Japanese?
Yeah. So, there's a lot of discussion about all of this. And to an extent, there was a lot of accusations that the KMT wasn't fighting and that the CCP was fighting, or they were prepared to fight. Now, it's not that the CCP was completely inactive, but I think, when you can think about how much we're talking about the casualties that the KMT forces have sustained, the nationalists, I don't quite understand how we came to the conclusion that the KMT wasn't fighting.
Right.
I mean, hundreds of thousands of men lost their lives by this point in time. And the CCP, by comparison, has lost a lot fewer in this conflict. If you look at Zhou Enlai's own account of the fighting up until this point, and this is, I think, reports that he's sending to Stalin, the CCP had only sustained 3% of the casualties of the entire, Chinese forces in the first 3 years of the conflict.
So that's 3% of
total Chinese, so including KMT and CCP forces, if you just add up all the numbers, they only amount to 3%. And, they would launch some larger campaigns. I mean, I think the most famous one, I believe, is called the 100 Regiments campaign. But realistically, if you take a step back and look at the activities of the KMT and the KMT sustained more casualties and was probably more active. A lot of what the CCP would have been doing was more guerrilla, movements up in the north.
All right. So CCP was fighting the Japanese. It's questionable how much they actually were. But I got us off track. We're going back to Chiang now. He's in Chongqing.
Yeah. So remember, the nationalist government has all moved to Chongqing. This is pretty far west into China. So Sichuan province is the last province before you hit Tibet. So they're, getting close to the Himalayas, but they're still not outside of the reach of Japan. So during the time that the nationalist government, and this is, 1938, 1939, while they're in Chongqing, they are suffering horrendous bombing raids because the Japanese at this point are pretty much flying bombers over Chongqing and bombing the place at will.
And they don't have like an air force or anything like that to contest, really, do they?
I mean, they barely have an air force. And really, they don't have any anti-aircraft guns either. So the best thing that they have is an early warning system that worked pretty well to let people know that the bombs were coming. But most people didn't really have much in the way of places to go.
Right, but there's not really anything that they can do to stop the bombing.
Exactly. A lot of what they did was they carved out caves in the mountainsides, the hills in and around the city. Because it's a city that's very hilly and stuff. So people would, hang out there, but the devastation was real.
Yeah,
and you've
got to put your house in a cave.
Right, and you've got to think that there's this place that's swelled with people from eastern China. All of these new transplants that are swelling in Chongqing. So it's a crowded city, and now it's got bombs falling on it. And Sung Mei Ling, she writes to a friend that's in the United States and says, "The bombs have reduced rich and poor, wise and stupid, to one common level. Pieces of burnt flesh, which are extracted from the smoldering piles with tongs. Relatives and friends are still digging furiously. Do what you can to make your people realize that this death and havoc comes to us with the help of American gasoline and oil and materials for bombs."
Man.
So one thing that Chang's wife is stressing here is that the United States is still honoring a trade agreement that it had with the Japanese. So the United States is providing gasoline, strategic materials to the Japanese armed forces. So it's tough because the United States is, in one sense or another, helping the Japanese prosecute this war at this point. But FDR, what's his name again?
Franklin
Delano Roosevelt.
Yeah.
He's kind of coming around to the Chinese side at this point in time, and he's seeing that the United States and Japan are on a sort of collision course, and he was really working and kind of thinking about ways that he could slow down what he saw as fascist states around the world.
Now, was Chiang in contact with him at this point?
They were certainly, working the phones, trying to get them to kill this trade agreement, which FDR actually does. He abrogates the 1911 U.S.-Japan Treaty of Commerce and Navigation. And this basically cuts off supply of some of these important materials like gasoline to the Empire of Japan. And this, looking at it from the Japanese side, this is when Japan realizes, okay, we're going to have to do something about this American issue. Because, it's clear to them that we're coming down on the side of the Chinese and that we are two states that are sort of on a collision course. But Chiang saw this as a sign of support for the Chinese, and he believed that only America had an idealistic approach to foreign policy. He thinks the U.S. is kind of doing good, but this also points out that he's like, the Brits are not, they're not honoring their word. They don't have this idealistic approach to foreign policy. So it shows his pleasure with the United States, but his displeasure with Britain.
All right. So, like we said, FDR more or less ends the deal with Japan that allows more and more of this American materiel to flow into Japan because he was upset about the indiscriminate bombing of Wuhan.
Yeah, so, this sort of bombing didn't really take place a lot prior to this. The Japanese, they were kind of the first to really get into carpet bombing cities. So this was kind of a new thing.
This was like shocking to the world.
Yeah, like it had occurred. The birth of bombing and things like that actually took place during World War I. But this was still, when it happened in World War II initially, this was still something that was very, very new. And Japan was on the front end of this. And yeah.
All right, so FDR cuts the deal in July of 1939. Then, in August of 1939, shock the world.
Yeah.
The Germans and the Russians sign a non-aggression pact, and no one was expecting this.
Yeah, and this had very real implications for Chiang Kai-shek. Russia was worried about a few things, and Japan was worried about a few things. Germany and Russia signed the non-aggression pact, which means that they're not going to fight each other. And for Japan, who's at war with China, this is worrying, because that means if the Russians, the Soviets, they don't have to worry about their western flank. They can move more of their troops further out east and directly confront Japan and sort of check Japan's rise in that area.
Well, that's funny too, because Japan is worried about that, but at the same time, Chiang is worried that this is signaling the potential of a Japanese-Russian non-aggression pact.
Yeah, because, he's really worried about a Japanese-Russian non-aggression pact, because then that means the Japanese, they don't have to station nearly as many troops in that Manchuria area to, just in case the Russians decide to get involved.
Right.
So, this has some very real implications for Japan. And actually, during this time, Japan and Russia, they fight up in that Manchuria area. They fight in a place called Nomonhan, and it's bad for the Japanese. The Russians win a hard-fought victory at Nomonhan. They prove that they're better than the Japanese. And this is marks a really big shift for Japan, because Chiang is fighting the Japanese, but the Japanese they're a unified bloc, but there's also, factions and cliques within Japan and its armed forces. So you have the Japanese Navy that has its own plans, and the Japanese Army that has its own plans. The Japanese Army's plan is, okay, we're going to kind of move north, Manchuria, and we're going to confront the Russians, and we're going to get into Siberia. And then the Navy's plan is, we're going to move south. And that means getting into South Asia, like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. These are all places that are part of the French colonies. The U.S. has some territories there, the Australians. So they want to move south with this naval strategy, whereas the Army wants to move north with their own more land-based strategy. But
Japan was kind of a mess. Their military is not on the same page, but at the same time, you have the emperor.
Yeah, Hirohito.
Not actually calling shots either. It's like, who's in charge of Japan? Well,
that's a big debate. We've been debating to what extent Hirohito was calling the shots.
Right. And then even within the military, obviously, it's like, who's calling the shots?
They were competing. Yeah, definitely. The Army and the Navy are competing. And in this case, because of the defeat at Nomonhan, the Japanese Navy starts to win out. And then things get really crazy, because in September, so 1 month after that, Japan signs a tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. And then we have the actual formal formation of the Axis powers. And this would place them at odds with the U.S., Britain, and France, because now Chiang thinks the writing is on the wall. There's a war that's coming, and it's going to pit the West, U.S., Britain, France, against this new power block that's formed, the Axis, the Germans, Japanese, and Italians. And then the other question is,
what's up with Russia?
Where's Russia going to fall in on this?
They've got this non-aggression pact with Germany, but, who knows?
Yeah, so we don't know where things are going, and we've already kind of exited that main phase of fighting. So what's going on now is the Japanese are kind of trying to consolidate control over what they have in China. And they faced a lot of the same problems that the KMT, the nationalist government, had faced, in that they can dominate cities, But oftentimes the countryside, man, it's the wild, wild west. You know, they can't control all of that territory. So what they're trying to do is consolidate their power, but they've had horrendous losses. The Japanese, at this point in time, so we're talking 1939, 2 years into the conflict, they've suffered 500,000 casualties.
Man, and that's crazy because, you know, as you read about this period in Chinese history and as we've talked about it, it probably just sounds like over and over again the Japanese are working the Chinese, but it's important to remember that the Japanese are definitely taking losses too.
Yeah, I mean, they've entered into this sort of crazy war of attrition, and it's horrible, man. And when you talk about the numbers of the killed and wounded that the Chinese weather, that the Japanese weather, and that the Russians weather, it's mind-blowing.
All right, so we've got everyone taking heavy losses, pretty much, at this point.
Yep.
Enter our old pal, Wang Jingwei.
Yeah, so the Japanese were trying to consolidate their gains, right? And part of consolidating their gains meant forming a friendly Chinese government. So in the occupied areas, they were pushing to form a new Chinese government, the new real Chinese government.
If you can't have a real friendly Chinese government, just make one.
Exactly. That was the Japanese way of solving a lot of their problems. So remember, within the KMT, there were their own cliques, right? So Wang Jingwei was in the KMT, the nationalist government, and he was pushing Chiang to sue for peace with the Japanese because, I mean, in his eyes, the war was over. The Chinese had already lost. And Chiang, you know, having committed himself to resisting the Japanese, naturally, he refuses. And at this point, Wang Jingwei flees. He leaves for Hanoi. And then at that point, he accepts Prince Kanoye's offer to join Japan's new order in Asia. So Japan had been promoting this idea of a sort of new world order in Asia, where Japan would sort of lead that order. And they saw China and a lot of these other Asian countries as part of that order, but also under Japanese leadership.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but this was sort of Japan's idea of, like, Japan thought that Asia was behind the rest of the world in some regards. And so this was sort of Japan's move to kind of level the playing field.
Yeah, I think the part of the reason why Japan felt that they were in a position to lead this sphere was that they had successfully modernized.
Right.
They had successfully developed militaries, political systems that they thought could stand up to, you know, the European powers and the United States. So they felt that they were in a position to bring the rest of Asia up to that level. And in fact, a lot of this goes back to the end of World War I, and Japan tried to put in this sort of racial equality clause that would establish a sort of basis that all of these countries are sort of racially equal. In the United States and some of the states in Europe refused this clause. And it was, you know, the fallout from World War I helped Japan realize that they weren't going to get a fair run from the Western powers. So they felt that we needed to make moves to challenge these European states and the United States if we want to bring ourselves and the rest of Asia up to the same level.
It'll probably be really interesting to read some like history or even just like the actual documents like from a Japanese perspective in this whole time period from the Japanese perspective.
They absolutely believed that they were doing the right thing. They absolutely believed that what we're doing in China is for China's own good, and what we're doing in South Asia, this is for their own good. And they felt like if they would just listen to us and buy in, then all would be better.
Yeah, I bet that'd be fascinating to read.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff, man. But Wang Jingwei, he ends up in Hanoi, and Chiang sends some
killers,
some assassins to take him out. But they messed up, and they ended up killing his nephew. They ended up shooting him. And at that point in time, Wang Jingwei, he's already buying into what the Japanese are selling. So in January 1940, Wang establishes the puppet government in occupied Nanjing and begins kind of saying that he is now the head of the real, legitimate Chinese government. And from this point out, Wang Jingwei is synonymous with traitors in the same way that, as we mentioned before, Benedict Arnold is. And a lot of the people that remained in the occupied territories, especially those people that weren't like farmers or, you know, just poor people, a lot of times they were sort of stained with this taint of being traitors. You know, the question's like, oh, what were you doing in occupied Shanghai as a merchant? Why didn't you flee to the west with the rest of us and continue the struggle? But Wang Jingwei, he's the poster boy for all of this. So that's one schism within the KMT and the, efforts to fight Japan. And in early 1941, we have another major issue.
The new Fourth Army incident.
Yeah. So if you guys remember, Chiang Kai-shek had agreed to work with the CCP in combating the Japanese. But this second alliance, it didn't work that well. I think, the Second United Front didn't live up to a lot of what Chiang and his, the KMT was looking for, and the CCP, the alliance wasn't suiting them very well either. And there was some major friction.
So they end up clashing.
Yeah, literally clashing.
Yeah, so fighting. And then this is, again, sort of going back to what we had said about Mao and the CCP. This plays very badly for Chiang. And on like a world stage, Mao comes out looking like a victim.
Yeah. So what ends up happening is Chiang, there was an army that the CCP had that was called the New Fourth Army. And Chiang had ordered this army. They were operating south of the Yellow River. The Yellow River is the northern river of the two major rivers. And Chiang wanted this army back on the other side. So he'd given them some orders to move up. And this is a really fuzzy situation. I don't think we are 100% sure what actually happened here. But this army did not move back north. In fact, it marched further south. So at a certain point, Chiang Kai-shek says, you know what, man? It's time. Like, we need to teach these guys a lesson. Because he felt that the CCP and his armies had not been following his orders anyway. And I think they probably hadn't been. They were kind of doing their own thing. So one day, the nationalist troops attack the New Fourth Army. And they end up killing a lot of these guys. They killed or captured 9,000 members of the CCP's New Fourth Army. So obviously, militarily, they dealt the CCP a blow, but it looked bad for Chiang on the global stage. Because now it really did look like, what are you guys doing fighting each other? You guys are in this conflict to fight Japan, and now you guys are fighting each other. Like, this doesn't make sense. And because Chiang is the face of sort of China at this time, it looks bad on him, and the word gets out, Mao's like, hey, man, my armies, we're just
hanging out by this river, and then, Chiang Kai-shek comes over.
Shoots us up. What's up, man?
Thought we were friends.
But this essentially ends the Second United Front. So remember, there was that first alliance that the CCP and the KMT had established in the 1920s that fell apart in 1927 when Chiang purged the communists. So now, in 1941, this all falls apart again. And again, it looks like Chiang is, again, attacking the communists. And it didn't look good for him, man.
All right, so we are directly at this point in the run-up to World War II.
Yeah, the real close run-up.
And at this point, a Japanese officer's plane crashes, and the officer was found to have had plans on him for a attack on South China, correct?
Yeah, the attack itself was actually the plans for the attack into South Asia.
Okay.
So based on these plans, you could tell that the Japanese were gearing up for an assault on the French British colonies in South Asia. So you could tell that a broader war was coming.
Okay. And at the same time, though, Chiang Kai-shek's relations with the United States are kind of developing, improving.
Yeah. Chiang is now, he works the phones, and he's now included in the Lend-Lease bill. So this was actually mostly directed to go towards England. But now China's wrapped up in this. So there's been a guarantee that the United States would also provide material to Chiang's government in China.
And that's what the Lend-Lease bill was, in effect. It was a way for the United States to provide its allies, before they were technically allies, with material to fight this war.
Right. So it was basically like, we will lend all of this stuff for a real good cost, and you can worry about paying us back a lot later.
Yeah.
So it was basically fronting them some stuff so that they could...
While maintaining neutrality.
Exactly. And speaking of neutrality, on April 13th of 41, Japan and Russia signed a treaty of neutrality. And this was, again, not a great sign for Chiang's government, because this now means that the Japanese can start to worry less about the Soviets to the north. So they're now able to shift troops south to face Chiang and his forces. But at this point in time, Chiang is not exactly all that fazed, because he thinks that a broader war, a war that includes the United States, is only 6 months away. And he was remarkably correct in his assumption, because Pearl Harbor was only 8 months away when he started to talk about this.
And then on June 22nd, 1941, we have the invasion by the Nazis of the Soviet Union, breaking their non-aggression pact. And what was interesting about this to me when I was reading Taylor's account was that Chiang actually knew about this. He had received intelligence, and he had even passed it along to CCP, and he may have even sent it to the Russians, didn't he?
Yeah, he sent it to Stalin himself. I mean, obviously, this is a massive operation, 2 million German troops, and by some way, somehow, the Chinese had found out. And I think even, a lot of people had found out and had been sending warnings to Stalin, but he just didn't believe them.
What stuck out to me, what was interesting, was that, in my mind, reading this and having, heard of this conflict before, I always have the inclination to think of Chiang Kai-shek versus all communists, including Russia. And here is a very clear example that he was still allied with the Russians at this point, or at least they had some shared interests.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the one thing where it's like, he's obviously one of the most anti-communistic figures in history, but the picture is far more complicated than that. In this case, he understands that it's in his interest, in his country's interest, to maintain its close relationship with, or maintain ties with the Soviet Union, and he needs to warn them about this oncoming assault. So yeah, it's not as clear-cut as just saying, someone's anti-communist.
Yeah. So then later that summer,
the war is expanding even more. So we've got this massive conflict going on in Europe, and now the Japanese approve the plans for the assault on Pearl Harbor. Prince Kanoye, he ends up resigning because of this, because he thinks that the plans are rash and he doesn't agree with them. And this is when Hideki Tojo takes over this job and becomes sort of the head political figure, not counting the emperor in Japan.
Side question, how much real power did the emperor have at this point? Because it just doesn't seem like he has much.
Again, this is a sort of a debate that a lot of historians have had. There's some people we've talked about, the emperor, he has this sort of ultimate power in Japan, but he's been groomed since he was a young man to not exercise that power. So basically, a lot of the stuff that, happens in Japan in terms of these big military operations, political decisions, they have to pass through the emperor's desk. But some people have argued that the emperor was a rubber stamp. He just, being brought up this way, he just, once it hit his desk, he signed it.
Okay.
But, others have argued like, no, I mean, the dude is as culpable as any of these guys. He knew what was going on, and he actively took part. And there's no doubt that he was making some decisions with regards to the war, and he was a very real part of the war.
Okay.
But I think the position that we have nowadays is that realistically, the emperor, the military, even the people of Japan, realistically, they were all complicit in the way that Japan prosecuted the war.
So I guess my point is that he wasn't just like a figurehead, like purely.
No, I think my opinion
was
was that he was not just a figurehead. I kind of come down somewhere in the middle. Okay. I'd say he wasn't a figurehead. He certainly was able to wield some sort of power, which we can get into more when we talk about the, Chiang Kai-shek's victory in this conflict. But, Japan was the type of place where obviously the military wielded a lot of power, and they routinely removed, there were times when the Japanese military would literally kill someone. I don't think that they would have killed the emperor, but I don't think it was so easy as like the emperor putting his foot down and saying like, no, stop.
Okay.
You're not going to do this, because they routinely did things without the emperor.
Seal of approval.
Right, like the invasion of Manchuria.
Okay, cool. So then, just to bring us back, December 8th, 1941, the Japanese attack the United States at Pearl Harbor. Now, this obviously brings the United States into the war, but what does that mean for China and Chiang Kai-shek?
So this touches off the Japanese sort of southern plan. So basically the Japanese start attacking the southern colonies of the British, the French, and Chiang in this moment's like, I'm going to show a sign of, like good faith towards these guys. And I'm going to send some of my troops to help them out because after Pearl Harbor, Japan wipes the floor with everyone. They smoke the US, they smoke the British, they smoke everybody that's in front of them in South Asia. No one can stand in front of them. And Chiang orders his troops to Guangdong to relieve some of the pressure of the defenders in Hong Kong. So if you remember, Hong Kong is a British colony at this time, and it's basically at the bottom of China. So basically imagine like where the chicken's feet might be.
Chicken feet.
Yeah.
Got it.
That's where Hong Kong is. And the British are there trying to defend it, but really they're having a tough time standing up to the Japanese. Hong Kong will fall relatively quickly. Chiang sends troops towards that area to try to relieve the pressure, but once he realizes that Hong Kong isn't going to be able to be saved, he ends up sending the troops up to Changsha, which is a good ways north. And they won some victories on this march north, and this was a good, kind of the only bright spot for the Chinese, the British, the Americans in this early phase of the fighting because, again, the Japanese are wrecking everyone. But Chiang feels pretty good.
And at this point, I don't think we've actually said it or not, but with Pearl Harbor, it kind of makes the United States and China, I don't know, would it be officially allies at this point or unofficially allies? Because they're obviously at this point then fighting the same enemy.
Yeah. I mean, once the U.S. declares war on Japan, Germany, the teams are set.
Okay.
At this point. And for the allies initially, for Chiang and his team, it's not looking good right off the bat. The British and the Americans lost every single battle against the Japanese initially. Every battle.
So crazy to think about because, again, we've only ever been alive in a period of, more or less uncontested United States military dominance.
Yeah.
And to think that they're just getting the floor wiped with them.
And think about this. China has been fighting the Japanese since 1937 by themselves. Little help, but they've been fighting this juggernaut for a long time. And now it's time that, like, the U.S., the Brits, they start to realize, like, oh, man, this was no small feat that the Chinese had pulled off. And, again, talking about this fighting in the South, this leads into Burma in December. So the country Burma, today it's Myanmar, but at the time, as a British colony, it was known as Burma. And Chiang says, hey, you know what, let me help them out here because the Japanese are attacking there too. So he sends his troops to Burma, and he's so set on having this really strong alliance. He even tells the British, he's like, listen, man, I'm going to send some troops, and you guys can even command them. Take control and do what you need to do. But the British were not keen on having their troops saved by the Chinese. It's like, no. The British will handle this, and you guys just sit back and watch. And this was, basically this one-eyed British field marshal named Sir Archibald Wavell was too proud to have the empire be saved by the Chinese. And Chiang rightfully was upset by this. He said, like, listen, why won't you take the time to work with us and listen to us on this? Because we've been fighting the Japanese for years by ourselves, and you have no idea how to fight the Japanese.
And I just want to interject something real quick that I remember reading from Taylor's book, and this might be off the timeline, but I believe we haven't talked about the Flying Tigers at all. And, we can go deeper on them later, but I believe they were American pilots, correct?
Yeah, so there's some American pilots that had come to China to fly air missions against the Japanese.
And they were more or less, you would consider them Chiang's Air Force. And at this point, he actually offers the Flying Tigers to help in the effort in Burma, all while he's still getting bombed in Chongqing.
Yeah.
Throughout this discussion, Taylor is talking about the historiographic debate that whether or not Chiang Kai-shek was actually, was he just sitting back and letting the U.S. fight his war for him, or was he active? And Taylor really points to this as, like, while his city is getting bombed, he is offering the only possible air defense he has to contribute in Burma.
Yeah, so, like Arif said, this is a sign that the nationalists, in my opinion, they were fighting.
Right.
And they were really, ready to contribute to the alliance. And, you have this formal alliance that's formed between the United States, the Soviets, Britain, and China. This is the big four. China and Chiang have finally been drawn into a really powerful alliance, and China's kind of returned on the world stage. This is, for Chiang, this is huge. And Chiang is cabled by Roosevelt, and he's told that he is now named the Supreme Commander of the China Theater by, the Western Allies.
Look at us. We're checking them off, dude. We had Dwight, so we had one Supreme Commander done. We got Chiang Kai-shek now, getting him done.
Mm-hmm.
We might as well just cover all the Supreme Commanders.
One thing that's interesting, though, is, so Chiang gets this order. It's like, hey, guess what? You're the Supreme Commander of the China Theater. Who else could it have been? Like, who were they considering?
Right.
Like, I don't know.
And it's also interesting, too, that they put him in command sort of with the expectation that they're going to really be calling the shots.
Yeah.
As we'll come to see.
So part of his command was that he would now be sent an American chief of staff. And
he requested that, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I think he knew what came with the role.
Right.
He definitely wanted more Americans in China.
Right.
Kind of helping out. So he gets sent this wily old guy named Joseph Stilwell, whose nickname was Vinegar Joe. Stilwell and Chiang's relationship is going to come to be extremely important.
He is someone we should probably cover at some point.
Yeah.
He's an interesting guy.
Yeah.
And he has gone a long way in forming people's opinion of Chiang Kai-shek.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, which is a longer conversation than we need to get into here.
Oh, we're going to get into it later, though.
Yeah.
But before Stilwell arrives in China, Chiang takes a moment to head off to India, man. So this is a really interesting thing, is that, remember, the Japanese are fighting the British, right? And they have a very anti-colonial stance. And India, it's a British colony.
Yeah. So
the Indians, they're kind of trapped in this position where they're like,
might get some freedom here.
Do we really want the Brits to win? And Chiang Kai-shek really is the only person that has some legitimate, anti-colonial credit on his record. So he decides he's going to fly to India and meet with Gandhi.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what he does, because he wants to stabilize Indian resolve. He wants to make sure that the Indians at no point decide that they're going to fight with the Japanese.
Yeah, basically my understanding of it was that he respected Gandhi's struggle for independence, but he also was like, please don't sabotage
what we got going on here.
Right, like we're still fighting the Japanese, and to my knowledge, there was a decent faction in India that was like, hey, the Japanese are probably better than what we've got going on, because as a colony, there are Indian conscripts who are fighting on behalf of the British Empire.
Yeah, and I think, and don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure there was an Indian soldier general that actually did fight on the other side of this conflict.
That's not surprising at all.
No, nor should it be. So on February 8th, Chiang flies out to India and he meets with Gandhi.
And Churchill was pumped about this meeting.
Yeah, Churchill was not happy about this. The British, for the most part, were like, whoa. This is our backyard. What do you think you're doing? And they were not happy that Chiang Kai-shek met with Gandhi. But I think if they had known what would actually come out of it, they would have been a little more okay with it.
Yeah.
Because, I'm going to read a quote here of something that Gandhi said after meeting with Chiang Kai-shek. Gandhi explained that nonviolent struggle against the British... Oh, I'm sorry. This is a quote from the book. Gandhi explained that nonviolent struggle against the British would go on, but he could guarantee that his actions would be so calculated so as to avoid benefiting Japan in its aggression against China. So he basically gets an agreement from Gandhi that, yes, we will continue our nonviolent struggle against the British, but we will do our best to make sure that it doesn't undermine the efforts to resist Japan.
And if I recall correctly, Taylor points again to this as a contribution that Chiang Kai-shek made to the Allied war effort.
Yeah. And, really, it rarely gets talked about. And Gandhi mentioned that this was a really important meeting for him.
Yeah, because it wasn't a short meeting either. I believe Taylor said it was 5 hours long, and they were speaking through interpreters, but
yeah, Chiang's wife, she
Sun Mei-ling.
Yeah, she interpreted for them. Obviously, English, Chinese.
Right.
So this was an important moment, and Chiang returns feeling pretty good. He heads back to China after having that meeting, and Vinegar Joe Stilwell is on his way to China. And Joseph Stilwell was a West Point graduate, And the crazy thing is he's actually a Chinese speaker. He served in China in the 1920s and 1930s, but he had no significant combat experience prior to this appointment. And the two of them, Stilwell and Chiang, develop a notoriously bad relationship.
One thing that was really interesting to me about Stilwell, not necessarily that he and Chiang didn't get along, but how empathetic he seemed, or sympathetic he seemed to Mao.
Yeah, well, that's sort of that becomes a hallmark of the Americans.
I know,
in China.
and it's just like, so, from obviously as someone who is not well read in Chinese history, it's like when you just read about like Cold War history and that sort of thing, like the idea that these American generals or politicians just in general would side with someone like Mao, this evil red communist, is just like mind-boggling.
Yeah, and we were still forming our opinions, right?
Yeah.
So it's showing like, oh man, these guys are communists, but you know what? Maybe they're all right. Maybe they're more like us than they are like the Soviets, maybe. So we were in a weird time here, man. And obviously that's a big sticking point in his relationship with Chiang Kai-shek. But one of the big issues that they had was that Chiang, having fought the Japanese for 3 years, or 4 years by this point in time, wants a more conservative approach. He's much more careful and defensive-minded. So he wanted they initially are focusing on this conflict in Burma. Because this area, if you don't know, so if you are looking at China, the southwestern portion of China, near the chicken's rear end if it's facing east, that's a really important part of South Asia where China's being resupplied by the United States, basically from, imagine, India to China. That space there is where you have trucks that are bringing in supplies, and eventually you'll have planes that are flying over the Himalayas, the hump, to resupply China. So securing that area is unbelievably important for China's ability to continue fighting in the war, and that's what Japan is trying to sever.
So there was the Burma Road, which was that, and if that gets cut off, they have to fly over the Himalayas to resupply, correct?
Right.
Okay.
And at this point in time, I don't even think the Burma Road is fully constructed.
Right.
Because I think portions of it are actually constructed by African-American soldiers.
Okay.
Or at least there's a road through there that's constructed with African-American soldiers with the intent of resupplying China.
Gotcha.
So Chiang wants a more defensive maneuvers in Burma, but Stilwell wants a more aggressive approach.
This is sort of funny and probably emblematic of U.S. military attitudes towards East Asia at this time, but it's like, who should we defer to? The person who's been fighting our enemy for years, or this guy who, West Point graduate, great, he's received some education, but he probably, we don't think he's had any sort of real combat experience. Yeah,
no significant, he didn't lead troops in significant combat prior to this.
And even if he hadn't been fighting the Japanese for years like Chiang Kai-shek had.
Right. And they basically put a lot of these soldiers under Stilwell's command in this fight for Burma. And, Chiang is kind of giving him orders, but he's listening sometimes and doing mostly what he wants to do. And when the fighting started in Burma in March, Stilwell realizes that he had problems getting these Chinese generals to actually listen to him because, obviously, he didn't know the situation in China nearly as well as Chiang Kai-shek. And obviously, sometimes he's doing things that maybe Chiang doesn't agree with, so maybe Chiang is sometimes saying, like, I don't know about following that order. But things don't go well. And actually, in April of 42, Stilwell suffers a crushing defeat. And what he ends up doing is he ends up retreating out of Burma in kind of like the Long March for the communists, but not nearly as far. But it's basically his forces are routed, and he's like, I'm going to India. Through the jungle. So he had to march through the jungle with a small detachment of sort of bodyguards and some other people. And it was hard slogging, and Stilwell by this time, I think he's in his 60s, man. So he was a tough old bat.
Yeah.
But the bad thing is he abandoned 100,000 of Chiang's best troops.
Yeah. So I don't want to gloss over this. This was the commander. He was supposed to be leading these troops. Mm-hmm. There were 100,000 of them. And when the going got bad,
he was like, I'm out.
He just pieced out in the jungle. And what was crazy to me in reading Taylor's account of this was that when he emerged from the jungle, he was hailed by the Western media as some sort of hero.
They were like, this is a win.
Yeah, who had executed some daring escape.
Yeah. It was
a daring desertion.
So the 38th Division, which was under his command, followed him to India. And he was like, his diary has him saying, like, barely staying ahead of the horde. And the 22nd and the 29th divisions managed to actually return to China, actually, after taking heavy losses. The 200th Division also made it back to China. But, all of this ended up costing 3,600 British troops killed and 7,000 wounded. 25,000 of China's best troops were killed in action. And all of this only cost the Japanese 4,500 casualties. And the Burma Road was severed at this point. So that's when they have to start flying supplies in.
All right. So we've got damage done, Burma Road cut off, Stilwell, Western media hero.
Yeah. China's mostly isolated, but Stilwell got his retreat.
That's right. And that's actually where we're going to pause for this episode. Melvin, do you want to give us a brief recap of everything we've covered? I feel like this has been a very wide-ranging episode.
Yeah. So we started off with China fighting the Japanese by themselves, the fall of Wuhan. But now the World War is on. The United States is supporting China. So are the rest of the allies. But unfortunately, they've lost Burma, and China is, at least for now, isolated, and it's difficult to resupply China. So right now, they have the alliance that Chiang Kai-shek always wanted, but the fighting is still tough.
All right, cool. Before we let you go, we would like to remind you real quick again how you can support the Life of X if you would like to. The most impactful way would be to leave us a 5-star rating, write us a glowing review in iTunes, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, tell a friend. Melvin, do you want to talk about the support page on lifeofx.com?
Yeah, so if you go to our support page, you'll find 3 buttons. One of them is to our Patreon, where if you want to become a patron, you can contribute however much money. We have like 5 tiers? 4 tiers?
I believe we have 4 tiers.
Where you can sign up and support us that way. You can also go through our Audible link, which will allow you to get 1 free book, and we will get some sort of compensation for that.
We're not exactly sure how much yet.
Right. But, if you're into audiobooks, man, really take up the opportunity and sign up through our link, and you'll, again, get a free book. It's a great way to listen.
And I'd just like to say, I love Audible. I've been using them for years, and I think a subscription is fantastic. But even if you don't want the subscription, there's no reason for you not to go get a free book.
Right. You can sign up.
Get your free book, and you can keep it on your app and be done.
Right. And then you can also click through our Amazon portal. So if you're buying anything on Amazon,
like a television,
I know all you swole guys out there need that protein powder.
Get it from Amazon.
Click through our link, and we'll get, a couple half pennies.
That's right. Hey pennies, I believe is what they call them.
Is that really?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll get some doll hairs. And we appreciate you guys. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.